Welcome to the deep dive. If you've been following global headlines, well, at all recently, you know that trade and economic policies, especially tariffs, have just profoundly reshaped international commerce.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like it's everywhere.
Yeah, it really does. It impacts major industries, even, our own household budgets. But have you ever really stopped to think about the deeper ripple effects? Like what happens way beyond those initial headlines?
It's a really critical question because while tariffs are, essentially just attacks on imported goods,
Right.
and they're often put in place for reasons like boosting revenue or maybe protecting domestic industries or trying to fix trade imbalances, the actual consequences, they're way more complicated.
How so?
Well, the cost, naturally, it hits the businesses importing the goods first. But we've seen this happen over and over. It pretty much always gets passed down.
The consumer.
Exactly, through higher prices.
Yeah.
So it affects everything from, I don't know, the car you might buy to the food you see at the grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. And we really saw this play out, didn't we, over the past few years, especially when the U.S. rolled out some pretty significant tariffs, particularly on goods coming from China.
That was a big one.
That move, it just set off this cascade of international reactions, right? It forced economies all over the world to adapt in ways, well, I don't think many people saw coming.
And that's really what our deep dive is about today. We want to unpack those adaptations.
Okay.
Our mission here is to really dissect the tangible, the real world impacts these tariff policies had. How did different countries, different industries, even regular consumers navigate these huge economic shifts?
Well, it actually worked.
Yeah, what observable strategies came out of this? How did nations and businesses manage? Did they just survive, or did some actually find ways to, well, maybe even thrive amidst all this disruption? We're going to look at three key approaches that really define this global economic reshuffle.
Okay, sounds good. So where should we start? Maybe with the supply chains. That seems like ground zero for a lot of this.
Definitely. For decades, companies worked so hard to optimize their global supply chains. Everything was about efficiency, lowest cost, often that just-in-time model.
Right, lean and mean.
Exactly. But tariffs, they just throw a huge wrench into that. They add costs onto imported parts or finished goods, and suddenly these really carefully balanced networks become, well, vulnerable.
So if your main component from, say, country A suddenly jumps 25% in price.
Your whole model can start to crumble.
Yeah.
It puts everything at risk.
So the big challenge then was, how do you stay profitable? How do you keep access to markets when your usual supply routes are suddenly way too expensive or even politically tricky? What was the main response?
I think the most significant strategy we saw was this fundamental reevaluation and, crucially, diversification of global supply chain.
Diversification.
Yeah, and this wasn't just about finding a slightly cheaper supplier somewhere else. It was more strategic. It meant shifting manufacturing or assembly, or where you sourced intermediate goods, moving to countries that weren't hit as hard by the new tariffs.
Oh.
The focus really shifted. It went from purely chasing efficiency to building a resilience. That was a huge strategic change for a lot of global companies.
Resilience over pure cost cutting. Can you give us a specific example? Who felt this pressure and how did they react?
Oh, absolutely. Let's take Chinese solar panel manufacturers. Huge industry. They were facing substantial tariffs on their panels coming into the U.S.
Right, that was big news.
Yeah, so their standard export model was suddenly in serious trouble. So what did many of them do? They adapted. They moved significant parts of their assembly operations.
Where did they go?
We saw this big surge of activity and investment into Southeast Asian countries, places like Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia.
Okay.
So by doing the final assembly in one of those countries, which wasn't subject to the direct tariff, they could then ship to the American market and effectively bypass that direct tariff hit. It was a really clear example of what economists call trade diversion.
That's a clever rerouting. But I wonder, were there any downsides or maybe unintended consequences for those Southeast Asian countries trying to suddenly absorb all this new manufacturing? Was it smooth sailing?
That's a really important point. Because while it definitely created new economic opportunities in those places, a common pitfall is seriously underestimating just how complex and time-consuming these big supply chain shifts really are.
It's not just flipping a switch.
Not at all. Rapid reorientation is tough, especially if an economy maybe doesn't have fully developed infrastructure yet or isn't deeply integrated into those really sophisticated global value chains.
You mean those complex networks where different bits of a product are made all over?
Exactly, those highly specialized, interconnected production lines. So shifting things too quickly can create new problems, new bottlenecks, maybe environmental issues, labor challenges, unexpected costs. It's not just the companies feeling it, the host nations feel it too. Maybe the local roads aren't ready or there isn't enough skilled labor right away.
Okay, so it's complicated. If you're trying to figure out if these supply chain shifts are actually, working out in the long run, what should you look at? What are the signs?
Well, the clearest way to track progress is probably by watching the shifts in global export patterns.
Okay? Like where goods are coming from.
Precisely. For instance, if you see a noticeable jump in manufacturing exports from places like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, heading to the U.S.,
Hmm.
that could signal successful trade diversion is happening. It suggests these countries are becoming the new, maybe lower cost sources for goods that used to come primarily from the country facing the tariffs. You can literally see the rerouting of trade flows in the data.
So the big takeaway here isn't just about moving factories around. It sounds like it's a fundamental shift, prioritizing resilience, maybe even security, over just pure efficiency. Could
Mhm.
that mean maybe higher prices for us consumers globally in the long run?
It's certainly a possibility. It's definitely a question worth thinking about. Are we seeing the end of that hyper-optimized just-in-time era?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Beyond what companies were doing, governments obviously played a huge role too. When these external shocks hit, how do they try to cushion the blow back home?
Right. Because when those tariffs land, the economic strain definitely ripples inwards. You start seeing things like slower GDP growth, maybe lower industrial output, potential job losses in different sectors.
Which affects everyone.
It really does. Businesses, consumers, it creates a real challenge to just maintaining internal economic stability. Sometimes it can even, spark social tensions.
That sounds like a serious challenge for any government. What tools did they use? What kind of solutions did they try to roll out?
Well, governments have a pretty powerful toolkit, mainly through fiscal and monetary policy.
Like taxes and interest rates.
Exactly. They can use these proactively to try and buffer their economies from these external trade shocks. The goal is usually to boost domestic demand, maybe give some support to local industries that are hurting, and really crucially, just maintain overall financial stability.
Hmm.
Think of it like the country's economic immune system kicking in.
That makes sense conceptually. But how did this actually look in practice? Especially for a major economy like China, which was really at the center of a lot of these trade tensions.
China's a really interesting case study here. In response to the trade war, they rolled out this multi-pronged domestic support strategy.
What did that involve?
Several things. They raised the personal income tax threshold, which basically put more spending money directly into people's pockets.
Okay.
They also cut the top rate of their value-added tax, which helped businesses by lowering their costs. And then they really ramped up infrastructure spending.
Building roads and bridges.
Yes, but also focusing on things like green infrastructure and supporting strategic industries. It sort of signaled a longer-term push towards maybe more technological self-reliance. And on top of all that, they cut interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, trying to stimulate investment.
Wow, that's a lot of intervention.
It was significant. And we saw similar stimulus measures, maybe not quite on that scale, but similar ideas in other Asian economies that were also feeling the pinch from the trade shifts.
But is there a risk in relying too heavily on just these domestic fixes? Can it, create other problems down the line? What's the potential pitfall here?
That's a really critical point. A major pitfall is indeed relying only on domestic measures, especially if the external trade disruptions are really severe and go on for a long time.
Why is that?
Well, while these policies are vital for stability in the short to medium term, they might not be enough to completely offset really deep economic strain if tariffs stay high for years. Plus, they can have their own costs, right? Like maybe increasing national debt or potentially causing inflation if demand picks up too fast.
Or propping up inefficient industries.
Exactly. You risk creating industries that become too dependent on government help, which could actually hurt their competitiveness globally in the long run. It's always this tricky balancing act between providing immediate relief and ensuring future sustainability.
So, if we're looking at a country's economy, what signs tell us if these domestic policies are actually working? How do we measure that success?
You'd want to watch those key national economic indicators closely. Things like GDP growth rates, are they staying stable or maybe even improving despite the external pressure?
Okay.
Look at industrial output, is it holding up? And consumer confidence, are people still feeling okay about spending? If those indicators stay relatively strong or bounce back, It's a good sign that the domestic policies are doing their job, kind of absorbing the shock.
Right. So ultimately, these domestic policies are about providing that crucial stability for people and businesses, helping the economy ride out the storm, basically.
Precisely. Empowering the economy to absorb those external hits and hopefully recover faster, but always keeping an eye on those potential long-term trade-offs.
Oh.
Strengthening the core, as you said.
Okay, so we've talked supply chains, we've talked domestic policy. Our third key strategy for dealing with these trade disruptions gets at another fundamental risk, putting all your export eggs in one basket.
Yeah, that's a classic vulnerability. Any economy or even a specific industry that relies too heavily on just one single major export market is really exposed.
Because if something goes wrong with that one partner.
Exactly. If trade tensions flare up, or if that dominant partner suddenly slaps on tariffs, a huge chunk of your export revenue can just vanish, almost overnight. It's like a business losing its biggest customer. The impact is immediate, and it can be devastating.
So how do economies guard against that kind of concentrated risk? What's the strategic play?
The key strategy here is diversification again, but this time for export markets. It means actively going out and developing new international markets for your goods.
Not just waiting for orders to come in.
Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
It requires proactive engagement, maybe negotiating new trade deals, really understanding what consumers in different countries want. The whole idea is to spread that market risk across a much wider base of trading partners.
So you're less dependent on any single country.
Exactly. It's that old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Just applied at a national economic level.
And this really hit home for American farmers during the trade disputes, right? Tell us a bit about their experience.
Oh, absolutely. American soybean farmers are a prime example. China had been, by far, their largest market.
Huge market for them.
Immense. Then China imposed retaliatory tariffs, and suddenly, U.S. soybean exports to China just plummeted dramatically.
That must have been a crisis.
It was, not just economically, but politically, too, in many farming communities.
Yeah.
But what happened next was really interesting. Those farmers, yes, with some government help, but also showing incredible resilience themselves, they successfully diversified where they sold their soybeans.
Where did they find new buyers?
They worked hard to cultivate and increase exports to other markets. Places like Mexico, Egypt, the European Union saw big increases in U.S. soybean imports.
Did it make up for losing China?
Not entirely. The scale of the Chinese market was just massive, but it significantly helped offset those losses. It was a really powerful, real-world demonstration of why market diversification matters.
That's a great example of adaptation under pressure, but what's the biggest mistake? What's the pitfall businesses or even whole countries make when they try to diversify their markets?
I think a common and often quite costly mistake is waiting too long. Failing to proactively identify and start building relationships in potential new markets before a crisis actually hits.
So being reactive instead of proactive.
Exactly. Too many rely only on their established, comfortable trading relationships, even ones that seem really solid. But that leaves you dangerously exposed if geopolitics suddenly shifts trade policy. Building new markets, it takes real time. It takes investment in relationships. You have to understand new regulations, maybe even adapt your product. If you wait until you're already in crisis mode, you're just scrambling, not executing a strategy.
Right, you're playing catch up. So if a country or an industry says they're diversifying their exports, how can we tell if they're actually making progress? Is there a simple way to measure that?
Yeah, probably the simplest way is just to look at the numbers. Monitor the percentage of countries' total exports going to different regions or different specific countries. If you see that the export destinations are becoming more spread out, less concentrated on one or two partners, and if you see trade volumes growing with a wider range of countries, those are really strong signs that the diversification strategy is working. It shows that strategic shift away from over-reliance.
Got it. So ultimately, building that more resilient, more flexible export base helps ensure greater stability, helps keep growth going, even when things get choppy with geopolitical trade tensions.
Absolutely. It's about building a robust global sales network that can better withstand shocks.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. Bring it all together. What we've talked about today really shows how profoundly these tariffs, which seem like simple taxes on the surface, can just reshape global commerce, can't they?
Oh, definitely. From forcing these fundamental shifts in, how and where things are made, the supply chains, to driving really innovative domestic economic policies within countries, and then forcing everyone to rethink who their trading partners are,
Yeah.
the impact is just huge and far-reaching.
It really feels like the global economic landscape is going through a massive transformation. Like we're moving away from that era of maybe almost unfettered open markets towards something that feels more defined by, I don't know, economic nationalism, strategic government intervention.
I think that's a fair assessment. The old rules, the ones many people took for granted for decades, they seem to be changing fast. And new ones are kind of being written as we go.
So, what does this all mean for you listening to this, trying to make sense of this complex world?
Well, maybe the most fascinating part is seeing how trade, which used to be seen mainly as just, an economic activity,
Right, about business.
has now become such an undeniable tool of geopolitics.
Yeah.
And that inevitably seems to be making the world feel a bit more fragmented. It's prompting this really fundamental shift in priorities, away from just chasing maximum efficiency and much more towards prioritizing resilience, maybe national security.
Which raises a huge question, doesn't it?
It does. In a world where economic policies are increasingly being used as tools of national power, how are future trade relationships going to evolve? What kind of new global structures might actually emerge from all this ongoing change? It's a massive question with no easy answers right now.
Definitely food for thought. We really encourage you to reflect on just how interconnected our world still is, despite these shifts, and maybe consider those unseen ripples of these global policy decisions in your own life, your own understanding of the economy. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And if you found this exploration valuable, we'd genuinely love to know if you'd be interested in more deep dives like this, exploring topics right at that intersection of economics and global affairs. That's it from us today. This is Lisa and Jim signing off from PodTalk. Hope you all have an informative session. Please like and subscribe for more such sessions. We hope to see you soon with a brand new topic of discussion.